mean, I know Bernard would have a lot of things to say about that, but I'm going to ask him not to speak yet, and I'm also going to resist temptation to butt in myself, hard as that is. Try and bring people from the floor in. We've got 40 minutes, and I think what we'll try and do is get, quite a few comments and questions, then come back to the panel and try and do that a couple of times, if that's okay with everyone, rather than do one-on-ones. So we'll start over there, yes. And can you say who you are, please? And wait for the microphone to come to you, because otherwise you won't be picked up by those people watching online.
Tilo Hatzius from Germany. I have worked 35 years in development. I have done evaluations, but not the size of evaluation, but I can put myself in your position you are in. And I also acknowledge the position you are in. I'm very glad pointed out, because I would have needed much time to point these things out. You have to point. But still, you both are within the box. I have been outside the box since 3 years, and I haven't really gone into the subject, the details anymore. I'm following a few newsletters. That's why I found out about this occasion today to come in and listen. I'm just visiting my daughters here, and I'm very glad I had the opportunity that I just happened to be here to listen to this evaluation. And as I said, you are in the box and you asked the right question. Can we just draw a line and say, well, we are evaluating and our conclusion is this doesn't really work. Let's pull out aid. Aid is doing more harm than it helps. And especially all the details you were pointing out encourage me even to be more insistent on this, because you also ask, instead of adjectives, you're asking for numbers again. I'm an agriculture economist. I have done cost-benefit analysis. I have the demand for numbers. It's just killing everybody. And I have listened into the World Bank evaluation discussions, high people working in the world or working for the World Bank. And they have definitely said all these cost-benefit analysis numbers are manipulated according to demand. And I have lived through this also, and I have resisted, gladly enough. I have been working in an completely independent institute, and so each of my evaluations could really raise the questions, and I resisted to do any cost-benefit analysis which didn't come up with the 12% which we asked for. So that is my conclusion, and it's a little bit sharper than yours, but I see after 3 years with a little bit distance of what I have done, really nothing has changed, and I'm going more and more to the conclusion, which there's a German group saying, pull out of Africa, and there are many books written on it, and I agree to these conclusions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gentleman here.
Thomas Finney. Thomas Finney from the Japan International Cooperation Agency, JICA. Thank you, Bernard. Great presentation, and thanks, Alison, as well. My question picks up on a little bit of what Alison was talking about just towards the end of her comments around you mentioned, Bernard, the striking exceptions among the bird community. I'm quite interested to know a little bit more about, I don't want to be diplomatic and not naming names, but exactly what made those exceptions so striking and some of the contributing factors behind it. Thanks.
Thank you. We'll just kind of move this way. So we'll take this gentleman and this gentleman, and then we'll go over there.
Willie McCourt, University of Manchester, and my question also follows from Alison's remarks. Any presentation that concludes that we ought to redouble our efforts always makes me quizzical. And what I would like Bernard to address is the question of donor accountability. Are there actually firm limits?
Sorry? Firm limits.
Actually firm limits which in any realistic scenario cannot be evaded, where although in four with partner countries donors will nod and say yes, yes, as if they're accountable exclusively to their development partners, you know, they are risk averse because they're also accountable to public accounts committees, they're the media. I mean, here in Britain, yesterday morning's Daily Express led on Britain contributing more in development assistance than any other country in the world. Surely those things have to be factored in if we're going to be realistic about what progress we can make.
Thank you. We'll just take this gentleman and then Paul.
Alex Park, independent consultant. I was reflecting on this earlier in the week, and essentially what we've been looking at here is the D of development. And I wonder whether, when we talk about engagement in the political economy and sort of greater emphasis given to this, whether we should not be thinking more about diplomacy and defence as well. And of course we see the three in Afghanistan, whether they work together in harmonisation to enhance the impact of development is questionable, of course. But in limiting the question, I can understand why the DAC would limit it to development. I think we're not looking at the overall national agenda of a country like the UK.
Okay, thank you. And we'll just finish with Paul over there.
Thank you. Paul Ackroyd. No fixed abode, but I worked for quite a long time with DFID. My last job was running their aid program in Ethiopia, where I spent rather a lot of time trying to implement the Paris principles on the ground. So a couple of questions to Bernard, points which I picked up from the executive summary, which didn't resonate in your presentation. I want to comment. You say in the executive summary that multilaterals didn't really engage very heavily in the report. Particularly, reading between the lines, it looks like the World Bank and the UN are particularly not involved. I'd like to say something about that, because that's really serious, actually, because not only of their importance, but the key role they have in coordinating aid activities. Secondly, you say in the executive summary that the principles of Paris apply to all forms of aid, and that's of course right. I wonder whether you could say something about perhaps the differential way in which you saw this being implemented. It seems to me that where there has been progress, it has been most in the areas of financial aid, which have been better coordinated around budget support, program aid. In the areas of technical cooperation, which is, we had report over the years about the ineffectiveness of technical cooperation, it seems to me that very little progress has been made. And just in parenthesis, I think it's a shame you took the health sector, because in my experience, that tends to be the best coordinated sector. I think if you'd taken agriculture, water, you'd have found a very different picture. Just if I can pick up Alison's point, because I think it's really good about donors and why donors are. I mean, it's too easy to say donors are or donors aren't. I mean, I think what you have to realise is the big battles going on in most donor agencies, and this came through very clearly to me when Richard Manning, the ex-chair of the OECD DAC, came out to Addis to talk to us. He said, well, what he finds is that in aid agencies you tend to find tremendous enthusiasm for this at the country level, and at the policy thinkers in aid agencies. You do not find much buy-in at all of the compliance and the procedure people. And I would go on and say, I don't actually think you get very strong buy-in, by and large, at the political level. I think very few, even recent British development ministers have really been committed to this agenda. Of course, they're not going to say they're not committed to it. If we look at their behaviours, I think there's a long way to go in getting commitment.
That's very helpful, Paul. Well, what I'm going to try and do, we've had a number of questions, including on does aid do more harm than good? Alison mentioned it, and also a gentleman there, role of numbers, and Paul had a question about other types of aid. But most of the questions there, and a significant part of Alison's comment, were about donors and the fact that it seems like, how much change have we really seen? So what I'd like to do, we'll come on to those other questions later, but if we can focus first on those kind of questions around donors, what are the striking examples of donors that haven't done anything well? Are there any striking examples of donors that have really done well? You've mentioned DFID. Is this intractable problem of donor accountability ever going to change? And questions specifically on multilateral.
Yeah. Okay. I am not surprised that the phrase "striking exceptions" came up. The striking exceptions were the high performers, and as I've said, and we've stressed in the report, it is truly regrettable that we don't have a stronger mechanism for actually comparing donor performance. Now, not that you can compare country performance in any rigid, strictly quantitative way, and I'll get to that, because of the diversity of situations. But let's face it, donors are somewhat less numerous to begin with, and there's a more of a history of standard setting and so on. And we actually test a little bit the mechanisms that are there for, you have DAC peer reviews, but they're one, only the bilaterals, two, they're periodic, so they're every 3 years, and therefore you never get a standing photograph of the whole family. And you know, we looked at one stage and said, well, hell, there's been, the monitoring survey indicators have been done over this period. Why not just take the raw scores on that and see what that does? And it is catastrophic in terms of the quality, the coverage, and that's clearly why nobody's tried to do it. Although I have to say a couple of the efforts that are being made by the Center for Global Development and some others put, in my view, hugely excessive emphasis on a number of those monitoring survey results with respect to donors. So when we say striking exceptions, what we heard through the country evaluations, which were the primary base, is some donors are doing a lot better. We had said to them all the way along, tell us who, name names, give evidence, and we got fragmentary anecdotal evidence, and we've recorded it. And coming back to the numbers point.
Are you going to say?
Eh?
You've recorded it. Are you going to say it and name any names?
Oh yeah, where we have them, we do.
Right. Are you going to name them now?
No,
Oh,
because
so they're all
they
country
don't.
specific.
But they don't go across the board. That's right.
Right, okay.
There are two areas where we have it in the report where it's quite clear. One is decentralization, where there is some fairly hard evidence and where there's pretty good evidence that this makes a positive difference. And two is transparency, where there's some reasonably good evidence across the board as well. Those are the only two areas at this stage where you have that. And I'm not going to give you my short list because I still don't have what I would consider rigorous enough evidence. As I say, on those two fronts you have it, but there are up to five among the donors. Let's come to the multilaterals for a second. In any such grouping, the World Bank would automatically include itself at the top of the list. But who knows how you can compare that with anybody else? And basically, we even found in a number of country evaluations an assertion that the bank did not feel that it would be appropriate for it to participate in, say, formal division of labor exercises and so on, because obviously it has a global governance structure and presumably takes care of these things internally. Is that going to be satisfactory? The key gaps were not the UN, by the way. The UN did actually participate in one of the studies in phase 1 through the UN Development Group. But if you look at the coverage of major donors, the World Bank and the EC would be the most glaring non-participants. And once again, they may well both contend that they have other means of doing this, and or I think there was one assertion this wasn't independent enough for the World Bank, because the World Bank claims against all evidence that it has the most independent evaluation function on the planet. And I'm sorry, Bob Picciotto's not here.
So we've got, if I may, so we've got that, you know, some donors are doing quite badly. There's a couple of exceptions.
Yeah, but Alison went too far in generalizing because when the list she,
just
for one second, the list she gave of things the donors are doing, that was not a list for the whole family. That was some of the factors that were identified, but they're key. I grant you that. And overall, it holds up our general conclusion. They're doing less well relative to their commitments. Sorry.
Okay. Well, yes, but so that's the evaluation. They're doing less well relative to their commitments. The gentleman here says, so is the kind of recommendation try harder
Yep.
a sensible one, given again what Paul says. You know, these tensions of political accountability towards their own constituency, rather than these kind of fairly ethereal ownership issues. Is it? Can we expect serious improvements in donor performance?
Okay. Well, let's start. I mean, we went from Alison's hypothetical possibility, scrap aid reforms. Say, okay, that's done or not done. Let's move on. Move on into the wilderness is where you're going, or worse. This gentleman says scrap aid. These are as another hypothesis. These are perfectly respectable hypotheses, but you know, frankly, I'm not sure. Well, one, we're talking in the context of our evaluation, but are these serious possibilities, or do you actually say, look, this aid reform effort was the culmination of decades of experience, decades of saying what is going right, what's going wrong, coming together finally in a global compact which was more balanced than it's ever been in history, to say let's try to grapple with this. And the results are mixed. I do not accept that we're just saying redouble your efforts. Not at all. Now maybe I didn't get it across clearly enough. We don't say, you know, keep on banging on about these 5 principles. We said transparency, mutual accountability, and shared risk management. Now, mutual accountability was in the 5 principles. It's recorded as being the one where least has happened. It is the one where you can make a difference. And we made a proposal as to how you do that. It's not working anywhere properly. How do you manage the situation where one country is dealing with multiple donors, all of whom have got their accountability requirements back at their home bases and so on, and they have more power in most cases than the country does? How do you actually manage that? And clearly, in order to manage that, you need some kind of mediating function, and I use that term very, very carefully. We recommend that there's a role for objective third-party participation in this, in order to manage these dynamics.
Yes.
So that is...
That's a very interesting recommendation that emerges in the evaluation that you didn't mention your...
And I should have, because it's absolutely key. Now, we're not prescribing exactly how that should work, because that really that could vary. And it's been tried in various places with varying effects. But if you've got this dead end, and you say, how do you get out of this dead end? We don't say, just redouble your efforts. That's nonsense. You've got to have a dead end breaker of some kind, an impasse breaker. So I think that's an important element. And you know, we're not naive in terms of the accountabilities that donors have at home. But you say, and the compliance people not being very happy with this, as Paul talked about, you know, and obviously there's a tension there. But one of the key things you say is this is recognized as a deal between countries. It's not a treaty, but there's a big deal, and it matters. It's a big deal out there in the world. This has changed the tone of North-South relations. Yeah. So it's not a case of DFID, having a concern with the Auditor General, I'm sorry, probably using the wrong term, and so on. This is the United Kingdom, whose reputation's on the line. Now, the United Kingdom has done better than most in this regard. But many others where they've got scattered different, we talked about uncoordinated entities, where you've got multiple donor bodies. They're not even coordinating among themselves. So given the stakes, those high-level stakes between countries, these are relatively minor issues. Even to say, you're doing work in development in far-off countries, your normal auditing requirements, and we all agreed we would try and get standardized auditing requirements. And it's happened in some places.
Okay,
these kind of things can be managed if you care enough. And if you don't care enough, you're not serious about development cooperation.
Okay, thanks very much, Bernard. I'm going to bring Alison back in now, but I am actually going to say one very quick thing. Well, firstly, what do you think about the recommendation of engaging a third party in the mutual accountability trying to improve mutual accountability, which I found to be one of the most interesting recommendations. We've got a question here from Masumi Owa, which says, do you think there should be, from Warwick University, do you think there should be an enforcement mechanism installed in the DAC? That's for Alison at the moment, but you may want to comment on that. And I suppose my personal comment would be, yes, it's clearly the donors aren't moving fast enough, but isn't it the case that, you know, really donors tend to move slowly on everything, and it's all a question of political interests, and what the Paris agenda has done is really give power to the hand of the recipient countries. You know, they don't need to wait for donors to move. That's never going to change very much, but they're more powerful.
Okay, I'm only going to take 2 minutes because I think there are others who want to speak. There's not much in your comments there that I disagree with, actually, Jonathan. I think let's be clear. What I didn't say was we should junk aid reform. I actually didn't say that. What I said was I'm not sure you get there from here. That's a different point. But I think the fact that what you have in this evaluation is a very strong script around partner countries doing it for themselves in a way and taking this thing and running with it is the really good news story. All power to their elbow. Fantastic. Let's focus our efforts on that. And maybe perhaps part of the response to these very complex donor accountability challenges, which the report does give good sort of coverage to how difficult that makes the politics of some of this in donor agencies, is to say, focus. This is all about ensuring that recipients are in the driving seat. Bottom line, everything you do needs to support that, and I have absolutely no problem. I think that's absolutely critical. But what I'm not convinced of is then another iteration of indicators around some aspects of these principles is actually going to get us any particular greater transformation out of donors than we've had to date. But that's what I want. Just finally, just on the numbers point, Bernard, I mean, if you're saying that the monitoring survey is basically junk,
I didn't say
because all these donor performance indices that now are built on it really overweight its importance, whether it's quota or quality of aid or anything else. The monitoring survey is one of the outputs of the Paris Declaration. That's another thing.
I hope it's not junk, 'cause it's taking over my life at the moment. I'm working on it quite hard.
Can I respond?
Well, I will ask you to, because actually it's not just that question about your overall view of the monitoring survey, but actually you do have some interesting views on which indicators are quite helpful and which aren't, and that would be interesting to come back on. But I'll bring other people in now. Owen, you had a question. Can you wait for the microphone, please?
Sorry.
And then we'll take two over there just for a minute, and I've got one from online, and then also Paul has a question that isn't answered about other kinds of aid, which is quite an interesting question.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, Bernard, for a very interesting evaluation, very complex task, and thanks to Alison for what I thought were really excellent and provocative comments. I'm Owen Barder from the Centre for Global Development, and I guess I should insert a plug for Quota, the Quality of Aid Index. But, there are 30 different indicators, most of which are not from the Paris Monitoring Survey in Quota. It covers 152 different donor agencies. The idea that there are not that many agencies to analyse isn't right. There are actually more UN agencies working in development than there are developing countries, let alone more donor agencies. So there is actually a huge range of and a lot of interesting evidence there. In particular, given that there are so many different donor agencies from the same country, up to 25 in the case of the United States. What's interesting is that you find that in the same country you get a very big variation of performance, which suggests that it isn't to do with the law and the politics of aid in that country necessarily that drives differences in agency behaviour, because some agencies in the same country are able to implement Paris, which should mean that the political and legal context is there for other agencies to do the same. So I once challenged the idea that this is just a fixed given for each country. And I think that's the question I want to ask, and it relates to Alison's idea that perhaps we need to rethink Paris. I think Alison was right to say that what Paris does is raise the price of bad donor behaviour, but I don't think it does it nearly enough, and I don't think it ever could. And it seems to me that we are in this deep equilibrium of wanting on the one hand to try and make our development assistance more effective, but but on the other hand being constrained by political, commercial, legal constraints. And we end up where we are as an equilibrium between those opposing forces. Paris marginally shifts the cost of bad behaviour so that we get slightly better aid, but it seems to me we have to address more fundamentally the drivers that lead us to be where we are. That's why I'm very interested in transparency, because it seems to me that opening up and understanding the huge costs involved in this inefficient behaviour is going to be the kind of thing that makes it politically unsustainable to go on doing what we're doing. And I don't think we get there by having more communiques, more declarations. It seems to me it doesn't matter one jot what's in the Busan Declaration about how aid should be. If we don't actually begin to change people's understanding of why it needs to change and what the costs are of doing it badly, you know, these are we talk about these declarations as in a rather technocratic way, but you know the estimates are that just predictability alone is costing maybe 20 or 30 billion dollars a year of effectively lost aid because we're not making our aid predictable. We can predict similar numbers on transparency, similar numbers on alignment. These are human lives that are being lost because we can't get our technical act together. And it seems to me that Paris is never going to change the politics of this enough to really make the difference in the aid system that we're trying to achieve.
Thanks very much. And as the
Do you
microphone.
agree? That's the question.
That's the oldest one in the book, Owen. That is the oldest one in the book. Thank you very much. And just as the microphone goes over there, I mean, we haven't. I mean, in my view, the biggest driver for change could well be the emergence of major new actors in most of the very aid-dependent countries. It's not something possibly covered by this, but far more than a political declaration in Paris is the fact that the competition, or let's say the diversity of different forms of financing, is going to massively challenge the politics of donors. Yes.
I'm Randy Wonderwala from Share Profits Consultancy. Very quick question. So if the Paris Declaration didn't exist, would we have still seen the same level of progress that you've been talking about, i.e. mixed progress?
That's an interesting question.
I'm Eric Gutierrez, I'm governance advisor at Christian. In light of the discussions, I wonder if this term, exit strategy, is something that ought to be brought back into the picture, because I mean, overall, if you look at it, aid will be successful when it's not anymore needed. But the way a lot of the aid programs have been programmed or designed is that there is no explicit mention of when it will be scaled back, when it will be, when the resources would dry up. And if we look back at for example, one example in history, which was the Marshall Plan. It was a 4-year program from 1948 to 1952, quick dispersing, and then so in many instances it was able to achieve some of the reconstruction targets in Western Europe. So just, you know, if a recommendation of try harder is not the right recommendation, should we look into something like, should there be a more explicit exit strategy of aid? You know, donors programming so that they will reduce aid, and then even the partnerships, even the different country partners, if they know that the aid will, you know, it's not it's not something that will flow forever. It's something that they have to make use of in the next 4 or 5 years. Then they may, you know, it will also change behaviors.
Okay, thanks very much. What I'm going to do, I think, is I've got like 4 specific questions that I'd like to put to Bernard and see if we can get quite short answers to them, because I don't want to kind of open up a discussion about exit strategy or aid dependence, or actually about development and diplomacy. I mean, what we've got Bernard here, and it'd be good to really get into detail on some of what the evaluation is telling us about these issues. So, do you remember Paul's question about other forms of aid, not just financial aid, technical cooperation? Have you got a 30-second answer to that?
No.
Okay. Have you got a slightly longer one, but not very long one?
No.
Well, okay.
No,
Well,
not
maybe that's
really.
something to discuss later.
Yeah,
Okay, fine.
I think I'd like to.
Sorry about that, Paul.
Because our time is short.
Yeah. You've got a very direct question, and this is one that I think the evaluation answers very clearly. Would things have been different if there hadn't have been Paris? One of the oldest and most difficult questions in the book. It's a counterfactual, but you've tried to answer it.
Yeah, one of the disciplines that we applied, particularly when we got to the development results issue, but even on the aid effectiveness one, was in contribution analysis to say, a kind of mini counterfactual, to say, are there other plausible explanations which would exclude this as being an influence? And so that is built in, and the overall answer to your question is, would it have been the same across the board on all these varied results? No, it has made a difference.
Okay, thank you. Have you got anything that you think your evaluation contributes to the discussion about bringing aid to an end, an exit strategy, or is that really not part of what you were looking at?
It is interesting that that was built in to the Paris design as a vision, and it is not irrelevant. And one message we leave at the very end of this whole thing is read the Paris Declaration. You who have been preoccupied at the level of grand principles or monitoring survey indicators, read it again. That was 4 or 5 decades of experience built into that, and most of it is still relevant. It's also relevant, and I've got to piggyback this on, there's no brave new world coming through the new actors. The new actors are the worst on transparency, which is the fundamental requirement of everybody. So these, to say that there are a new political mix in the picture, sure they are, and they can be used one way or another. But fundamentally, those standards of transparency, if they are not applied more widely, that's going to be a problem, not an asset. The end of aid, we did run across that interestingly in a couple of middle-income countries, and I said that I refuse to accept a priori categorizations as behavioral, but in a couple of middle-income countries, it was quite clear that their approach to aid, given its overall position in their financing, and given the prospect that it will be diminishing, is a much more economical, if you like, in the classic sense, use of aid to say we must target this to where it can make most difference in relation to all our requirements and all our alternative resources. So
Okay.
that penny drops when you get closer to that.
Thank you. We'll come on to Owen's comment, stroke question, later on. On budget support, I've got a question here from Hernan Benchaya, who's the head of mission of the sector budget support program of the European Union in Bolivia. 26 million euros, for those who want to know. How does the panel assess the contribution of budget support to the principles of the Paris Declaration? And again, the question is, does this evaluation add anything to our thinking on that?
I think it does, in the sense that one of the monitoring survey indicators, I think mistakenly, and over some protests, if I understand it correctly, of many said, more budget support is better, and there was a target of 66%, I think, for 2010. That has not proved out. Has budget support proved to be effective at both general and sectoral budget support in a number of cases? Yes, it has. Has it proved to be any more risky than other traditional forms of tightly controlled project aid? No, it has not.
Okay, you're doing very well. I've got one more specific question, then we'll move on
Getting
to...
briefer here.
Then we'll move on to Owen, and then we'll have one quick round, again, of anyone who's got burning questions. And this is an interesting one. It's quite specific, but I think it moves to a broader point, which is one that comes up a lot about whether the Paris Declaration helps or supports governments too much, recipient governments too much, as opposed to state and civil society and the impacts of that. It's Kevin Kelly from CARG, an AIDS research and evaluation organisation in South Africa. It's our impression that in East and Southern Africa, medium and small national NGOs have been jeopardised by the retreat of bilateral funding, especially given the weakness of country funding and support mechanisms, to say nothing of those advocacy organisations that some governments would prefer not to exist. To what extent was the impact of Paris on this sector a concern of the evaluation programme? You can take a bit longer on that, because I think that's an issue that comes up a lot.
It's a very big issue, and there's been there were a number of assertions from very early on that this was a widespread effect, and we looked for evidence. We found scattered evidence in a few cases, where you could say this has happened. But one of the assumptions, well, clearly in terms of the process of getting this big deal in 2005, to get those two herds of cats together to agree, in other words, governments in developing countries and donors, was obviously a huge enough endeavor. And in that, the wider consultative participatory framework was not strong enough. And I think that was recognized by the time of Accra, and something began to happen. But what began to happen is quite interesting, in that you heard loud squawking from civil society participants to say, you know, we have to be recognized as actors in our own right and all those things. And that's fine, and that has now triggered, I think, a searchlight coming on to what is understandably, and we must be fair, a very enormously diverse community. But to say, and what about your own standards? And what about your guarantees? Because in fact, on transparency, we got a very strong reading across a large number of evaluations that there's not enough transparency around aid that was flowing to non-governmental actors. So, you know, there's no assumption of an unmitigated good there or an unmitigated bad. There's evidence that's got to emerge. But key things that have got stronger are legislative engagement. That was recognized in Paris, but it got stronger at Accra. Legislators were there. It is absolutely intrinsic to pushing ahead. And because traditionally the relationship has been between executive branches in donor countries and executive branches in developing countries. And that is clearly unhealthy from every point of view. At a minimum, legislative branches...
You find that in the evaluation?
Absolutely.
So there's evidence that legislators, parliaments are more involved, but we don't know about...
And need to be.
...civil society as such.
No, civil society is engaged. And I mean, clearly there are vested interests in civil society organizations as any other set of institutions. And the assumption, one of the key assumptions in Paris was, we are intent on trying to help countries achieve effective public sectors that can do their minimum tasks with some integrity and competence. If you actually don't believe that there's any hope in your country that you'll ever have a government that can do that, then obviously you're going to think this is all a waste of time or great damage. But that is kind of a heroic position to take, to say we will never have a government that's effective.
Okay.
So that's some of the underlying stakes in that proposition. But we did not find, we found 2 or 3 suggestions in the different evaluations that there had been a discernible effect in that direction.
Okay, thank you very much. And finally, and we will just have one very quick round, what did you think about Owen's comments?
Where to begin?
But briefly, if you can, there was transparency and there was donor incentives.
We agree on transparency, obviously, and the proliferation of the donor. I knew there were that many, and that in itself is a problem, a huge problem. Incentives on the donors. I'm not sure I quite remember the question. I'm sorry.
My point is that Paris won't change it.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's so easy to say. Some things got to. Is the Spirit of the Holy Ghost going to descend on us and do it? No, I don't think so. So you have to work with what you've got. And what you have is a framework built up over decades, a consensus without precedent to say these make sense. Some shifts, not just redoubling efforts, saying, no, get serious about mutual accountability. Recognize transparency is a foundation for it all, and that means the other actors as well. And grow up and recognize there are major risks in this, and tell your people that if you're going to get into it. I think those are some of the, but your point about different agencies within countries is true, but countries are still responsible at the end of the day. This is seen as a deal between countries.
Okay, and Alison, brief
just
comment.
Really quickly, I mean, I think
another round. Actually, why don't I want to just take in a couple more questions, then you can round us off. That's probably a better way of doing it. So, is there anyone else who wants to ask a question? 1, 2. Okay, fine.
Hi, Joanna Ferrens from the Aid Effectiveness team in DFID. I just wanted to make one quick comment just about how incredibly useful this evaluation is and how important it context of preparing for Busan, and how important it is to have it now, in time for positions to be firmed up and for donors and partner countries to come to Busan with an evidence-based position. And I think it's fantastic that it addresses these questions about politics and incentives. These are going to be crucial for Busan. Just on the point about evidence, I mean, I think Paris, there is a critique of Paris that says that it was based on evidence of what didn't work in the past. And what we want for Busan is that it's based on evidence of what does work. And that's, you know, that's why this evaluation is so valuable. So I just wanted to press you, Bernard, on the point that Alison made initially about narrowing down the agenda to what we know works and to what really is catalytic in, you know, stimulating change. And you pointed out that the evaluation talks about transparency, mutual accountability, and risk management as really key issues going forward. But would you say these are key at the expense of other principles, or is it in addition? And is there any differentiation between the different principles, or did you just look at the Paris Declaration as a whole? Thanks.
Thank you. Very interesting. What I'm going to do, I'm going to ask Alison to come back, and then Bernard can have the last word. There's a lot of issues even just coming up in that question. And it links, I think, to what I asked you earlier that I didn't have a chance to, which is about indicators and which ones you think are particularly good. Yes, this lady here.
Rebecca Carter, independent consulting on Bernard, you mentioned that about the incredible consensus behind the Paris Declaration. I wondered what the evaluation found in terms of how that consensus played out over the implementation period, whether it's decreased or increased, and what that means for getting into the sign and the outcomes.
Okay, thank you. So we'll ask Alison for a minute or two comments, and then Bernard really for a minute or two comments, because people have to do tend to have to leave at the right time.
Thank you. I won't do justice to all those really interesting points at all. Just two quick ones to finish up on. First, in response to Owen, yes, I agree broadly. I mean, I think the interesting thing about the transparency push, and I have sort of huge respect for all the work that's gone into that, I do think we need to also be clear that transparency isn't enough, and that one needs all the kind of processes and institutions around it to know what to do with that really good sort of flushing out of data and costs and information. But I know you know that. On just a general point, I mean, I think what is interesting, really interesting about Paris, and is that it kind of created a new authorizing environment for donors and partner countries to kind of get on with this agenda that was absent prior. Now, I think that's interesting. But then I still don't quite agree that there is no alternative to that particular authorising environment. I think we can evolve it. So that's really my point. I don't accept, Bernard, I mean, you keep coming back to there is nothing else. I think we're getting trapped by our own propaganda there. I'm not entirely convinced of that. But I do, you know, nevertheless agree that we're on a particular track with, you know, this particular agenda now, and it's important to be constructive going into Busan. But the need to construct a different authorising environment, to my mind, still remains a very important agenda.
Thank you. Bernard.
Okay. Thank you all very much. What did work, what didn't work, I'm not saying keep on doing, I said that, we're not redoubling our efforts. This is an evolved strategy we're recommending, and that should be clear. And not only do we say emphasize this and this, we also do say de-emphasize that and that, and that is in the report, and you can find some of it. What's happening to the consensus? Not sure. Accra was tricky, but tricky for a number of reasons, and I can't fully analyze what was going on, what was going wrong, what was going right there. But I do agree, at the end of the day, it's not more grand declarations that are going to make the difference. It is an underlying dynamic, and I appreciated our colleague from DFID's point that to get this dialogue going now, and you know, one of the things that we were absolutely intent on in our report, by the way, I have to say this, there is barely an acronym in that report. This is comprehensible to real human beings.
Yeah, it's true.
And that is not an accident. And it's very, very important. And it's on time. which two pretty damn key things, I think. In I won't go there. I do not know. But on, I will come back to the other question about, in a sense, evolving it and so on, and its numbers and indicators. Alison at one point said we don't need another iteration of indicators. We are sure not leading you there. But with respect to numbers, there are, one of the things we have not touched on here is 2 big fat chapters of detailed country evidence, which is solidly based and quoted and sourced and cited. Do you not think if we could have squeezed numbers out of that would be credible? We would have loved to do that. But we said we will not make up numbers. We will not force artificial numbers just to have numbers. Because frankly, there's enough of that out there already. Loads of it.
What would your final message be? So we have to wrap it up.
It's not saying, no, but don't take this lightly and recognize this. If you say, oh, everything's changed, it's a brand new, brave new world out there. A lot of what the new donors are doing is bad donor practice that we had before the DAC was even born, and part of the reason the DAC was born. Some of these standards actually really, really make a difference. They're hard won, they're hard fought. They can't be owned by the DAC anymore. They've got that, and that issue of the institutions, the ownership, the credibility, has got to be managed in the next phase, and it's hugely complicated. But recognize that this has actually been, to the extent that aid matters, which is an open question.